Good day and welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. In the previous presentation, we ended with Jacob leaving Canaan to head to Haran, where he had an encounter with God. And in this presentation on Genesis 29, we'll now take up the story where Jacob is now on his way to Haran, where we'll meet Rachel, his cousin, who would later become his wife, and they will look at how Laban deceived, manipulated, and tricked Jacob into marrying his eldest daughter, Leah. So this presentation is entitled Laban Deceives Jacob. The next three chapters from Genesis 29 to 31 will cover 20 years of Jacob's life in Haran until his return to his father's home in Canaan. So Genesis 29 verse 1 starts by telling us this. Then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. This is how the people of Mesopotamia were referred to, because Mesopotamia was in the east and they made their way from Mesopotamia to Haran, but they were still referred to as the people of the east. And he looked, and behold, a well in the field, and lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks, and a great stone was upon the well's mouth. And thither were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the sheep, and put the stone again upon the well's mouth in its place. So this well was a communal well. It served the community, and it's here that Jacob chose to stop to ask direction, because clearly he did not know where Haran was and did not know where his uncle's home was. So he stopped by this well because this is where people would come to get their water. It was a meeting place. And it was here that he would meet his future wife, Rachel. And Jacob said unto them, my brethren, he saw some individuals. And he said, my brethren, whence be ye? Where are you from? And they said, of Haran are we. So here, Jacob realized that he was in Haran. And he said unto them, know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? Nahor was Abraham's brother. So it was a relative of Jacob. Know ye Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, we know him. Jacob went on to ask, is he well? And they said, he is well. And as a matter of fact, behold, Rachel his daughter cometh with the sheep. And he said, lo, it is yet high day, neither is it time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go and feed them. And they said, we cannot until all the flocks be gathered together, until they roll the stone from the well's mouth. Then we water the sheep. So viewers, from this dialogue between Jacob and the individuals at the well, it gives us a clue that these were young boys who were not strong enough to move the stone from the well. So they needed assistance to do so before the flocks could be watered. Additionally, we can also deduce that these shepherds were young boys because of the rebuke and the command that Jacob gave them in Genesis 29 verse 7. Notice how he rebuked them. Jacob told him that it is yet high day, meaning it was noon. Neither is it time for the cattle to be gathered together. And this was a clear rebuke to these individuals. The command was, water ye the sheep and go and feed them. Viewers, Jacob would never have issued such a rebuke and command to grown men, especially after meeting them for the very first time, because it would have been culturally unacceptable and downright rude for him to do so to grown men. So we know, based on what we can deduce from this dialogue, that these were young shepherd boys who were mulling around at the well and not tending to the sheep. And Jacob himself was a shepherd. He's the one who took care of his father Isaac's business, and he knew how to take care of the flocks. And he was telling these young boys that they need to not idle around, but water the sheep and get them to pasture. Genesis 29 verse 9 tells us this. And while he yet spake with them, these young boys, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. So here we can also realize that Rachel was a shepherdess. And this is another indication that the community well was close to the city of Haran, because it was not customary for women to be shepherds. But if women were shepherds, they would tend the flocks close to their homes, because in that society, it was not normal for women to be away from, especially unmarried women, to be away far from their homes, because you know that men would tend to prey on innocent women. So this tells us that this well was located somewhere close to Haran, because Rachel came to the well to get water. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So it was clear, based on this verse, that Laban was Jacob's uncle. And Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept tears of joy, because he finally reached his destination and he encountered his mother's brother, daughter. Genesis 29, verse 12. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, father's relative, and that he was Rebekah's son. And when she heard that, she ran and told her father. And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And Jacob told Laban all these things. In other words, Laban clearly remembered the last time that someone from Abraham's family came to visit Haran. He remembered when Abraham's servant came and he came to seek a wife for Abraham's son Isaac. And when that servant came, that servant brought many gifts. He gave Rebekah jewels of gold, jewels of silver, and raiment. He also gave Rebekah's mother and Laban himself precious gifts. So when he heard that Jacob, one of Isaac's sons, had come to Haran, he ran to meet Jacob. And this was not customary for the patriarch of a family to run to meet someone. They would normally come to the patriarch's house. But in this instance, because Laban was a greedy individual, as we will see, as we discuss and study the life of Jacob, he ran because of what he was expecting. Because the last time Abraham's servant came, and he knew that Abraham was a very wealthy man, he came with material possessions, and he wanted more of the same. So, as a result of Jacob coming to him, Jacob told him all things, as the scripture tells us. Jacob told him the reason why he was in Haran, and that he had deceived his brother and his father. And as a result of his deception, that his brother wanted to kill him. And as a result of that incident, his mother told him to flee to Haran and stay with her brother for a while. So Jacob, as the scripture tells us, told Laban all these things about his circumstances and why he was now in Haran. So Genesis 29 verse 13 tells us that Jacob told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. So it was now a month since Jacob is in Haran. Genesis 29 verse 14 informs us that Jacob spent a month with Laban. And as we will soon read, he would end up staying in Haran for 20 long years. Whereas the plan was to stay with Laban for only a few days. And how do we know this? Let's flash back to Genesis 27 verse 43 to 45. This is the incident that took place after Jacob deceived and stole his brother's blessing. Notice what his mother told him, Rebekah. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice and arise. Flee thou to Laban, my brother, to Haran. And tarry with him for how long? A few days, until thy brother's fury turn away, until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. Then I will send and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be deprived also of you both in one day? So Rebekah clearly told Jacob that his visit to Haran would be for a few days, and Jacob relayed that message to Laban. So after a few days became a month, and Laban's expectation of a bridal price and expensive gifts were not forthcoming, Jacob had to start earning his keep. In other words, Jacob had overstayed his welcome as a guest after a month because Laban's patience and hospitality had clearly run out. So notice what Laban will now say to Jacob. Genesis 29 verse 15 tells us what he said. And Laban said unto Jacob, because thou art my brother, because we are relatives, shouldest thou therefore serve me for naught? Should you work for nothing? Tell me, what shall thy wages be? So he was saying to him, instead of you working for free, work for me, and I will pay you wages. Laban was very crafty. He was simply letting Jacob know in a very polite way that if he was going to remain in his home, then he had to do so as a hired servant, working for wages and not as a freeloader. You will not be staying in my home, living free, essentially. You have to work and you have to pay your way around here. That is what Laban was saying to Jacob. Genesis 29 verse 16 and 17 tells us this. And Laban had two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. The scripture draws an immediate contrast between the physical features of Laban's two daughters. Leah was described as having tender or weak eyes. The Hebrew word translated as tender is rak. It is Strong's H7390. It occurs 16 times. It has been translated as tender 9 times, soft 3 times, faint-hearted once, weak once, tender-hearted once. Leah was suffering from a condition that is called ptosis. It is a condition where the upper eyelid sags, droops, or covers a part of the pupil, which is that small round opening which lets light in, that is in the center of the iris. With ptosis, the levator muscle doesn't function the way that it should. As a result, the appearance of the eye is droopy, making you appear that you are sleepy. So this is how Leah looked. Both her eyes were droopy, and it wasn't a pretty sight. So Leah was tender-eyed because the muscle of the levator muscle that is in the eye that operates to lift the eyelid and close the eyelid was not functioning as it should. But in contrast, Rachel was described as being very beautiful and well-favored. So Leah was tender-eyed because she may have been suffering from a condition called ptosis, which is referred to as droopy eyelids. She was very pretty when compared to her sister Rachel. So whereas Leah had tender eyes, she had droopy eyes, Rachel was said to be beautiful and well-favored, which meant that Rachel had a lovely shape or a lovely figure. The Hebrew word translated as favored is mareh. You can see the Hebrew script here. And here is a picture of both sisters. Rachel is on the left. Rachel is looking very beautiful, and Leah is on the right. And you can see that Leah had droopy eyes. Her eyelids came over and covered the pupils of her eyes. So she had the appearance of what some persons call lazy eyes. But that's really another condition. But her eyes were really droopy because of her condition, which the Bible describes as tender-eyed. The Hebrew word mareh occurs 103 times. It is Strong's H 4758. It has been translated as appearance 35 times, sight 18 times, countenance 11, vision 11, favored 7. Mareh a view, the act of seeing, also an appearance, the thing seen, whether real, a shape, especially if handsome, comeliness. It has to do with looks. So Rachel was a looker. She was gorgeous. She was beautiful. And she had a beautiful shape, a beautiful figure. And when Laban asked Jacob, what will thy wages be? Because he met Rachel at the well, he clearly fell in love with her at that moment. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 70 years for Rachel, the younger daughter. So Jacob was very explicit. Jacob was very clear. There was no misunderstanding. Jacob told Laban that he would serve him for 70 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. Very clear. Jacob made a very generous offer to work 7 years for Rachel as his bridal price or his dowry. Because even though he received the birthright and would inherit his father's substantial wealth, Jacob left Canaan with no money. Therefore, Jacob could not pay the dowry. And before any man could marry another man's daughter, he had to provide a dowry in order to demonstrate that he was able to support his wife as well as to compensate the father for the loss of his daughter. Because children in that society were working in the family business, so to speak. They helped around the house. And when a woman gets married, she would leave her father's house and go to her husband's house. So the father had to be compensated for the loss of his daughter, who was a worker in his business. And that is what Jacob could not do because he had no money when he left Canaan. So in order to provide the bridal price, he was willing to work 7 years for Rachel, and that would be his dowry. And Laban said to Jacob in Genesis 29, verse 19, it is better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. This was a great deal for Laban because Jacob's offer worked out to be much more than Laban would have received if the payment was made in shekels, which was a monetary unit at that time. Jacob was in a very desperate situation because he could not return home until he received word from his mother, and Laban knew this because remember, Jacob told him all these things about his situation and about his predicament, and Laban would use Jacob's predicament against him. And Genesis 29 verse 20 tells us, and Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had for her. So Jacob labored for 7 long years for the love of his life, with only meal and accommodation as a part of the deal before he could marry Rachel. And now we will see the treachery of Laban towards Jacob. So 7 years have now passed. And Jacob said unto Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. So it was now time for him to get married and to consummate that marriage. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, not Rachel, that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to him. And he went in unto her. The phrase here, went in, means to have sexual intercourse. So on the wedding night, Jacob went in. Unbeknown to him, it was Leah, and he consummated the marriage. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for an handmaid. So after fulfilling his obligation of working 7 years for Rachel, Jacob was deceived when Laban presented Leah to him instead of Rachel. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. Notice, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? So it was Jacob was tricked. So here you can see Jacob's astonishment. In the morning, when he woke up, it was droopy eyes Leah instead of the beautiful Rachel that was in his bed. And he was upset. He was livid. Here is Jacob speaking to Laban. What is this that thou hast done unto me? Did not I work 7 years for Rachel? Why hast thou beguiled me? Viewers, it was possible for Jacob to be deceived based on the wedding customs of that time, where the bride was fully veiled until she was finally alone with her husband in the nuptial chambers, in the wedding chamber, prior to the consummation of the marriage. So right throughout the wedding ceremony, the bride would be fully veiled. Laban clearly presented Leah to Jacob when it was very dark, and Jacob may also have been highly intoxicated because in that custom, wine was a very big part of every wedding ceremony. And we can remember when Jesus came on earth, the first miracle he performed was turning water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana in Galilee. So wedding always had wine. And as the bridegroom, he would be toasting and drinking. So at the end of the wedding night, it was very dark. Jacob may have been more than tipsy, intoxicated, and when he went into the wedding chamber, he expected that Rachel would be the one that he would be consummating the marriage with. But it turned out that it was Leah. So it was very easy. We can understand how easy it was in that time for a man to be tricked, because the wife, the bride, was fully veiled until that time. And it says that it was in the evening, it was very dark. Jacob did not have a clue that he was being duped. Laban's deception of Jacob was very similar to the deception of Rebekah, in that Laban exchanged the older Leah for the younger Rachel. Whereas when Jacob deceived his father and his brother, Rebekah, his mother, presented the younger Jacob as the older Esau. So Jacob received a dose of his own medicine, because in life, as we all know, what goes around comes around. An unfair game often plays twice. Jacob deceived his father Isaac when he dressed up and impersonated his brother Esau. And now his father-in-law had deceived him when Laban dressed up Leah and made her pretend to be her sister Rachel. Jacob manipulated his father because he was blind, and Laban had done the very same thing to him in order to get what he wanted. What did Laban want? He wanted his older daughter Leah to get married. And because of her physical features, her physical imperfection, no man wanted to marry her. So he concocted this plan to get Leah her husband by deceiving Jacob. Jacob now felt the same hurt that his father and brother experienced as a result of his deception. And notice Laban's reason for deceiving Jacob. And Laban said, "It must not be so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn." And this was a common custom and practice. It was applicable for sons as well as daughters. The eldest son normally get married before the younger sons. And here Laban was saying to Jacob, in Haran, the older daughter must get married before the younger daughter. And it was true. That was a part of their custom and their culture. But he used the custom of the time to deceive Jacob, when Jacob actually worked 7 years for Rachel, and Jacob was very clear in the bargain that he struck with Laban. So after Jacob went ballistic, Laban's reason was that in Haran, the older daughter must get married before the younger. And since Laban knew that no man wanted to marry Leah because of her physical features, the droopy eyelids, Laban deceived Jacob. Jacob was now in a very precarious position because he had taken Leah's virginity and had to remain married to her whether he loved Leah or not, based on the culture and custom of that time. And here is the law that was codified, which came many centuries later. But these laws, this Mosaic law, were predicated or based on the culture and practices of that time. So in Deuteronomy 22, verse 28, if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and lay hold on her, and lie with her, and they be found, notice what would happen. Then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver. That was the most that a man would pay for a bridal price to marry a man's daughter. So he had to pay the maximum fine. or the maximum price. Why? Then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Why? Because he had humbled her, he has taken her virginity. He may not put her away all his days. So in other words, if you sleep with a man's daughter without agreeing terms with the man, and you have taken the man's daughter's virginity, then you shall pay the father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be your wife. So whether you wanted to marry her or not, the fact that you slept with her, you have defiled her, you have humbled her, you have taken away her virginity, you have to remain married to her for all your days. He may not put her away, or in other words, he may not divorce her all his days. So in biblical times, a woman's virginity was her most prized asset. And since Leah was no longer a virgin, it was highly unlikely that another man would want her, especially with her physical imperfection. We all know from scripture that Laban was a scoundrel. He was a dishonest person. But it was indeed, you must give him credit, a genius move on his part to get a suitor for Leah. And he knew that the 70 years that Jacob worked for Rachel did not count in this instance, because Jacob would still have to pay the bridal price for Leah. So viewers, with this in mind, notice Laban's new proposition to Jacob in order to marry Rachel. Laban said to Jacob in Genesis 29, verse 27, fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. So in order for Jacob to get Rachel to marry, he had to agree to work 7 more years for Rachel. But he had to fulfill Leah's week, because back then, the wedding ceremony lasted for 7 days, which is why Laban requested that Jacob fulfill her week. And after 7 days, he married Rachel by promising to work 7 more years for Laban, which was the bridal price or dowry for Rachel. So when Laban made a proposition to Jacob, Genesis 29 verse 28 tells us, and Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, that's Leah's week, and he gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. So Jacob did not have to wait 7 years before he got to marry Rachel. At the end of the week after the wedding ceremony for Leah, Jacob married Rachel and then worked 70 years to pay off the bridal price. And after the end of Leah's week, her wedding week, Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah, his handmaid, to be her maid. And he, Jacob, went in also unto Rachel. He then consummated the marriage to Rachel. And he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. So at the end of Genesis 29 verse 30, Jacob had now spent 14 years in Haran. And here you can see a picture of Rachel and Jacob getting married. Viewers, Laban's deception resulted in Jacob receiving 2 wives in 1 week, as well as 2 concubines later on, as the sibling rivalry intensified between the sisters, since Jacob never loved Leah the way a husband should love his wife. And Jacob clearly loved Rachel more than Leah. Genesis 29 verse 31. And when Jehovah saw that Leah was hated, and this word hated here simply means that he did not love her as he should, or love her like Rachel. She was unloved, in other words. It wasn't that he hated her. Clearly, he did not want her because he wanted Rachel. And that is why he loved Rachel more than Leah. When God saw that Leah was unloved, or as the King James Version put it, hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So in other words, both of these sisters were barren, but because Leah was unloved, God opened her womb. God could only open something that has been closed. So both Leah and Rachel were barren. So God had compassion on Leah because she was unloved, since she was placed in a very untenable situation. Just like Jacob, it was a patriarchal society, They were obedient children. She listened to her father and was placed in a very untenable situation. Just as Jacob was not the one who came up with the plan to deceive his father Isaac, it was Rebekah's plan. But Jacob, being an obedient child, followed through with his mother's plan, and he, as a result, had to flee from home. So God had compassion on Leah because she was unloved, and God made her very fruitful in the first 7 years of marriage. And Leah gave birth to 4 sons during that time, while Rachel was barren. And notice what transpired as a result of Leah's fruitfulness. Genesis 29, verse 32 to 35 tells us, and Leah conceived almost immediately and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, notice what Leah would do when she started to have children. Surely Jehovah hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. So Reuben means behold a son. So when she gave birth to her first son, she said, he's going to be called Reuben. And notice, it was the fathers who would normally name their children. But here, Leah took charge and she gave names to her children to reflect how she felt and how she was being treated. She said, surely Jehovah had looked upon my affliction. So she felt afflicted. And because she was trying to seek her husband's love, she said, now therefore my husband will love me because I've given him a son. And viewers, in that time, it was a patriarchal society. And a woman's most valuable role was to produce offspring, to produce children, and in particular, sons, because it was an agrarian society. Sons would eventually become workers in the family business, taking care of the flocks, and flocks meant wealth. So the more sons you had was the more workers the father had in his business. He would not need to have hired servants. If he had a lot of sons, he could use his sons as shepherds. And remember, Laban was a very mean, a very stingy, a very cheap individual. He did not want to. He had sons. And clearly, he was a wealthy man as well because he had flocks, many flocks. And instead of hiring servants to tend to these flocks, he used his daughter Rachel as a shepherdess because he didn't want to spend any money to hire servants to take care of his flocks. So children were valuable. So when Leah conceived and gave birth to a son, she said, behold a son. Now you will love me because I've given you a son. So when Leah conceived, she was happy because she was able to give Jacob a son. And it was her intention that as a result of giving him a son, he would love her. No amount of sons that she could give Jacob would ever make Jacob love her because Jacob only had eyes for Rachel. And verse 33 says, and she conceived again, so she was very fruitful, and bare a son, and said, because Jehovah had heard that I was hated, he had therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. So because she was hated, she was unloved, she was constantly crying to God to be loved by her husband. So when she gave birth to her second son, she said, I'm going to call him Shimeon, which means the word Shimeon or Simeon means to hear or heard, because when she prayed to God to be loved by her husband, she then conceived and gave birth to another son. And she said, because Jehovah had heard that I was hated or I was unloved, he had therefore given me this son also. He has given me another son. So maybe this time my husband will love me. So she was always vying for her husband's affection. And Genesis 29 verse 34 says this, and she conceived again. Bam, bam, bam. She was popping out babies like Skittles. She conceived again and bare a son, and said, now this time will my husband be joined unto me. So because I've given him 3 sons, now he will be attached to me or be joined to me. He will now stay at home. Therefore was his name called Levi. Levi means attached or joined to. So you can see in the first 3 instances when she gave birth to these 3 sons, it was in an attempt to seek her husband's love, her husband's favor, her husband's affection. And finally, when she conceived again in Genesis 29, verse 35, she realized at this point and she came to accept that no matter how many sons she gave Jacob, Jacob would not love her the same way he loved Rachel. And she became comfortable with that idea. And she conceived again and bare a son. And she said, now will I praise Jehovah. So she stopped trying to vie for Jacob's attention and she focused her attention on praising God for what he has done for her. God had made her fruitful and she had now produced 4 sons for Jacob. And remember, again, in that society, sons were valuable because sons meant workers, workers meant profitability, and profitability meant wealth. So she was fulfilling her role as a wife to produce offspring, and in particular, sons that would carry on the father's business. So when she conceived and bore the 4th son, she said, now will I praise Jehovah. Therefore she called his name Judah, and Judah means praise. And the verse ends by saying, and she left bearing. And I'll explain what transpired, why she left bearing. So even though Jacob did not love Leah, he was still fulfilling his conjugal rights. It was every husband's right to perform his matrimonial and conjugal duties to his wife by having sex with her. So even though he did not love Leah like he loved Rachel, he was still intimate with Leah, and because he also knew that he needed children of his own, he performed his conjugal duties to Leah. And by naming her children Leah, clearly reflected the way she felt and the way she was being treated by both Jacob and Rachel. So this brings us to the end of Genesis 29. When we get to Genesis 30, we will see how the sibling rivalry between Leah and Rachel would intensify. And then we will see that both their handmaiden, Bilhah and Zilpah, would enter the picture as they struggle and wrestle for their husband's attention. Jacob was caught in a very untenable situation himself. He worked 70 years for Rachel. He ended up getting 2 wives in the space of 1 week. And later on in Genesis 30, we will see that he will also get 2 concubines, because when these sisters realized that they were not getting pregnant, they would offer their servants to Jacob. Jacob would sleep with them and they would produce children, and these children became Rachel and Leah's children because these handmaidens served as concubines. They were not Jacob's wives. So as we go to Genesis 13, which is the next presentation, we will also realize that as a result of Leah's fruitfulness, Rachel would become very jealous. Rachel clearly gave Jacob an ultimatum that he was not to sleep with Leah anymore because she did not want her to continue having sons. And that is why the verse ended by saying that, and Leah left bearing. God made her very fruitful. So the only reason why she was not bearing sons anymore was because her husband Jacob was not having sex with her anymore upon the demand of Rachel, his beloved wife. And because Jacob did not want to be constantly nagged, he listened to Rachel and he was stopped performing his conjugal duties to Leah. All of this will be borne out as we look at Genesis chapter 30. I would encourage you to like, subscribe, and most importantly, share these presentations so others can also get a proper understanding of what was transpiring as we make our way to the book of Genesis to see how God brought about this nation, the nation of Israel. And remember, The second half of the book of Genesis was God charting the way and showing us how he established the nation of Israel by calling one man Abraham, who we have looked at, established his covenant with that one man Abraham. Abraham had the promised son Isaac. We looked at his life. Isaac had twins, Esau and Jacob. We are now looking at the life of Jacob. We are now looking at the 20 years that he spent in Haran. So we have now looked at the first 14 years that Jacob spent in Haran. And during that 14 years, Jacob would produce many sons. Ultimately, he would have 12 sons and one daughter by the name of Dinah. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And may God continue to bless us as we continue to delve into his words to prove all things. Have yourselves a great day.